we assert that such alliances must also acknowledge the sociocultural, artistic, linguistic, and other strategies that Indigenous communities have used and continue to use to respond to intensive ecological disruptions. So now just to say a few words about the Environmental Futures Program. So the Environmental Futures Program is generously funded by a Sawyer Seminar on the Comparative Study of Cultures grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Additionally, we thank our institutional partners at CU Boulder, the Nest Studio for the Arts, the Natural Hazards Center, the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies, and the Art and Art History Department. This public discussion is one of multiple, along with several art exhibitions around the Boulder-Denver area that will be hosted this semester and next as part of the 2020-2021 Mellon Sawyer Seminar titled Deep Horizons, Making Visible an Unseen Spectrum of Ecological Casualties and Prospects. We aim to traverse multiple disciplines and perspectives to investigate intersectional questions concerning the changing planet as it affects specific peoples, communities, wildlife species, and ecosystems in varying and inequitable ways. Some of you might be wondering how Environmental Futures and the Pueblo Action Alliance partnered up for this collaboration. So I'm from El Paso, Texas, which is downstream of the Pueblo Action Alliance on the Rio Grande. And I've been involved in environmental justice work along the river for several years now. And in the course of researching that and trying to see who was doing work in this region, I came across the Pueblo Action Alliance and was impressed by their advocacy and activism on the Rio Grande and on Pueblo lands, particularly their work to halt fracking around Chaco and their water justice campaigning. I noticed that their work kind of like dovetailed in a lot of ways with what we have been studying in the Environmental Futures graduate seminar. And so I reached out to Julia and asked if they would be willing to give this talk. And she said yes, and then she roped Marcus in, and that's kind of what brought us all here today. Now, without further ado, I'd like to say a few words to give an introduction about the Pueblo Action Alliance and then introduce our speakers. So Pueblo Action Alliance is a Pueblo-centric grassroots organization located in Southern Tiwa territory, so-called Albuquerque, New Mexico. Their collective efforts involve dismantling oppressive systems, community defense, global solidarity, and planning for their futures. Today, we are joined by two of their staff to present their most recent campaign called WATERBACK. Marcus Trujillo is a community member of the sovereign nation of Laguna Pueblo, 6 villages located west of Southern Tiwa territory. Marcus is the communication designer for Pueblo Action Alliance, excuse me, and co-leads social media direction along with coalition building. Marcus graduated from the University of New Mexico with a bachelor's in humanities with a focus in religious studies, a minor in peace and justice studies, and psychology. Marcus's studies have led to a deeper passion in graphic design and illustration for the movement, as his studies contribute to the decolonial work for Pueblo communities. Our second speaker is Julia Bernal. Julia Bernal is Yuchi on her mother's side and is a community member of the sovereign nation of Sandia Pueblo in Southern Tiwa territory. She is the Alliance Director of Pueblo Action Alliance and heads the organization's environmental campaigns, along with building founder relationships and national networking. She has worked in the water sector for almost 7 years and is now a dual degree master's student at the University of New Mexico in water resources and community and regional planning, with concentrations in policy management and natural resources and environmental planning. Her work is rooted in decolonizing water in the Middle Rio Grande while creating and reclaiming water management strategies that come from a Pueblo feminist perspective. So now that we have introduced our speakers, I will go ahead and turn it over to Julia for welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Julia Bernal. I am the current Alliance Director, as mentioned earlier, and I am calling in from my home, Sandia Pueblo, which is settled within the Middle Rio Grande and what we identify as Southern Tiwa territory. I just want to say thank you, Chilton, for our introduction into this space where we are going to talk about an an issue that is a bit undermined and is directly related to the climate crisis that frontline Indigenous communities are experiencing already, and the type of solutions and understandings that Indigenous people can implement in order to mitigate and adapt to changing climate. This picture encompasses just a small bit of our mountains' majestic formation that has taken millions of years to form. It is our altar, and we call our mountain Bienmer. And our village sits at the foothills of this mountain and also adjacent to our river, known as the Middle Rio Grande. But to us, she is the our river mother, our Blue River mother, that has led us to this conversation today. We are attempting to tie in sacred and cultural significance into the conversation around climate change and climate remediation, as well as bringing in a Pueblo feminist perspective on the issue of water that is regionally specific to our decolonial work. Again, Herkem, thank you for allowing this space to happen and come to fruition. This is our first conversation about WATERBACK. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to my little brother, Marcus, who is going to set our organizational framework and our values in which we organize from. Thank you.
Kwati se hopa waheno me gataya or shot sunu koyawashi kuwakumasta zimunasta awarukek so my name is Marcus Trujillo and my pronouns are he, him. I'm from the Pueblo of Laguna, affiliated with Parahi Village. Thank you, Chilton, for the introduction, and thank you, Julia, for allowing me to come on here and speak on our framework. I want to do a second land acknowledgement. We are calling in from Southern Tiwa territory, the settler name of Albuquerque. I just want to acknowledge and honor the Tiwa people, our Tiwa relatives and ancestors, the spirits, the non-human relatives that surround and steward and caretake for this land and who have always caretaken for this land. The reason we give a land acknowledgement is because we are on stolen land. This is stolen land as we are underneath the US empire. As it's acknowledged, we are under one of the youngest empires in the history of the world, and greater empires have fallen. And so when we do work that's surrounding LANDBACK, WATERBACK, and decolonial focus, we highlight that this is not a metaphor. This is very serious, that we are in action throughout our work. And this land will always be stolen until it is returned to its original caretakers. And we will continue to work for LANDBACK, WATERBACK movement. And we will continue to work through this decolonial process that we have all committed to, as our existence is political and our existence embodies the history that we and where we come from. And so to dive into our history as Pueblo people, we are consisting of 21 Pueblos and 21 sovereign territories throughout our southwestern lands, those of which are Acoma, Pueblo of Cochiti, Hopi, Isleta, Jemez, Giwa, Laguna, Nambe, Ohkay, Owingeh, Picuris, Pojoaque, Sandia, San Felipe, San Ildefonso, Santa Ana, Santa Clara, Taos, Tesuque, Isleta del Sur, Zuni, and Zia. And so just to give context for our community who's watching right now, to just give context of where we come from, who we are as sovereign nations. And it's always important that we acknowledge that we all come from a different history than the rest of our Indigenous relatives in Turtle Island. We come from a history of revolution. Our colonial story here is similar, but it's different from our Indigenous relatives in the surrounding areas of our region. And so we acknowledge that we are descendants of Pueblo revolutionaries, and we come from our ancestors who revolted in a widespread rebellion that was successful against Spanish oppressors, against Spanish rule that oppressed our ancestors, and that was and that really set back the ways of our people, of our life. And so we need to express that we are not monolithic. We are not a people who think the same or who come from the same language. You know, we all have different languages. We all have our different territories. We have our different ways of thinking and our different ways of life. And so we must acknowledge that history in our 1680 Pueblo Revolt, as we embody this work in our organization and as we move forward into our discussion tonight. And also just to bring up too, that this history, it is important that we recognize territories. It's important that we recognize these differences as they address regional issues, you know, and our needs are different, and all of our needs in our different pueblos are different, along with our needs from other tribes are different as well. And so it is important that we bring up these issues as it will pertain to WATERBACK as well. And so this will also, this history and acknowledgement also addresses that pan-indigeneity erases our identities as Indigenous people. And so acknowledging our full sovereign, our sovereign nations as Pueblo people, we move forward and continue to do this work. And so moving forward, we would like to read out some of our framework. And so our mission for Pueblo Action Alliance is that we are a community-driven organization that promotes cultural sustainability and community defense by addressing environmental and social impacts in Indigenous communities. Our vision is, which can be found also on our website, puebloactionalliance.org. And again, just to reiterate, we are the descendants of Pueblo revolutionaries, and we carry the revolutionary spirit of the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. We believe that the liberation of Indigenous peoples is the liberation for all. And so as we move forward into this work, it is futuristic that we include long-term goals and long-term visions within our framework. And again, this can be seen at our website. Encourage everyone to view our website when they get a free chance. And so before we get started into more of our deeper framework, I just want to introduce our full staff team. We have a staff team of 9. Of course, we have Julia, who is from Sandia, our Alliance Director. We have Reyes Devore, who's from Jemez Pueblo, our Community Programming Director. We have Sheldon Sonorio, who is working IT right now and making this possible for us to restream. From Kiwa, our Creative Strategist, works on comms teams as well. There's myself. We have Soma Holland, who is from Laguna and Jemez. They're currently in Lenape territory. And Corn, we have our environmental justice organizer, who is Dene Apache in Laguna Pueblo. Our youth organizer, Jalen Littlebear from Tamaya, also a co-founder of SIR, the Cultivating Roots and Resistance Youth Internship, which is also on our website if you guys would like to check it out. We have Sherelle Brown, who is from Kiwa Pueblo as well, our community defense organizer. And last but not least, we have Trenton DeVore from Jemez as well, who is our youth organizer and also a co-founder of our youth internship. And so moving forward, we would like to read out our 10 points of unity and just some context for these 10 points. These 10 points of unity are to accomplish PAA's long-term goals and vision of unifying and mobilizing Pueblo people. Pueblo Action Alliance's organizing strategies and tactics are shaped by these points of unity and encompasses the values that Pueblo people have protected since first colonial contact. And so to jump into this, I will be reading out these verbatim. We never start a discussion without reading our 10 points of unity. And so number 1 is to fight and protect our birthright as Pueblo Indigenous people. Number 2, to heal from cycles of trauma and oppression, to heal the land and waters. Number 2, to create intergenerational spaces and to learn and grow. Number 4 is to preserve Indigenous languages, traditional teachings, and oral his, her stories, and their stories. Number 5 is to dismantle and eradicate the oppressive system and European occupations that have killed, harmed, and assimilated Indigenous peoples. Number 6, to build international solidarity with the Indigenous global struggle. Number 7 is to mobilize the United Pueblo Front. Number 8, to attain water and land and water back. Number 9, to embrace intersectional identities by erasing the Eurocentric disease that has occupied the Indigenous spirit, mind, and body. And number 10 is to restore balance of power among peoples of all genders and non-binary. Along with our 10 points of unity is our traditional core values. And so although our Pueblo people come from different communities with different languages, different creation stories, and traditional societal structures, the teachings of traditional core values reign united and true throughout all of our Pueblo nations. PAA organizes and creates spaces based on the teachings of Pueblo traditional core values. And this list that we're about to go through, it's not limited to the infinite teachings that are passed down by our ancestors, but it provides a grounding in which we embody as we move towards liberation and revolution. And to read these out, our first traditional core value is respect. Number 2, consent. Number 3, protection of sacred entities. Number 4, cultural sustainability. Number 5, community defense. Number 6, self-determination and sovereignty. And number 7, traditional and popular education. And lastly, number 8, storytelling and oral tradition. And so this framework is important because it is vital that we go over our framework, and as it's important that our values set place as it allows us to reimagine our future as Pueblo Indigenous peoples. With water, it is extremely important that we set values for the framework that we move forward with. And this will help us shift worldviews as it speaks directly to decolonization and decolonial work that we have within our organization. And to break down our decolonial work and our perspective, we define decolonization as the removal of European occupation and a resurgence of Indigenous identity. And so this is embodied within our Pueblo framework, within our organization, as we have an all Pueblo staff. And our membership is fully Pueblo. We have Pueblo board of directors that we are able to gather with these core values and these points of unity, and we are able to move forward in the ways that we are passed down from our ancestors and that we can pass down to each other and our relatives who are not born yet. And so this really ties into our work as we engage in the conversation of land back and water back, importantly. And so as we move into the discussion around land back, we have, the movement for collective liberation and reclamation of everything stolen from Indigenous peoples, but there is no specific or set definition for land back. And to make it more clear and to have kind of more of a good lead, a tweet from Julia actually, which I would like to read out as it relates specifically to land back. So land back isn't about building a pan-Indigenous empire. It isn't about owning or reclaiming property. Don't misinterpret the Indigenous perspective with capitalist values. Our worldview surpasses the concept of capitalism and colonialism. And so to expand on this tweet as well, the conversation that I've had with Julia regarding this this statement is, that we are, again, not monolithic, and that each nation should have the vision for what land back means to itself and to its people as sovereign people. And so that basically allows us to understand the steps that are needed to be taken in order to achieve the vision that we need for our people and for our nations. And so so within that, this will be in a conversation, with land back and the statement we have of here in the Southwest, we cannot have land back without water back. And as we begin the discussion on water back, as a Pueblo male speaking about our framework on this presentation, and as a Pueblo male myself who's advocating for women in water, for women in natural resources and in STEM fields, I would like to fully acknowledge that we need to allow and support our women to be in these positions of power and these positions of leadership within this realm of work. It is very vital to our existence for this to happen, as they are original caretakers to our water systems, our spiritual and natural laws. Lastly, I would like to thank Pueblo Action Alliance, our FEM-led organization, for allowing myself to speak again on this framework, and just being able to have kind of set the precedent for our framework and what we're moving forward to and the conversations we've had as a staff team, and as the conversations we continue to have as we engage in this work. And so I would like to just pass it on back to Julia to discuss what Land and WATERBACK is, as it's very vital to our existence. So thank you.
Again, Marcus, thank you for explaining our framework, so that way those that are joining us here today can understand how vital it is for setting values in place, especially for something like water, a cultural resource as water, because water has a diversity of users, and with a diversity of users comes a diversity in perspectives and values on how our water is to be used. This is why we couple the global movement of LANDBACK with our WATERBACK conversation. Here in the Southwest, we are an arid, semi-arid environment that is going to, and it already is, experiencing the impacts of climate change. This comes in many different forms. For us, it's rising temperatures. For us, it is less snowpack. It is population increases. It is urbanization. It is a plethora of different issues, which is why we are setting the groundwork and formation on regionally specific solutions in order to have conversations about LANDBACK and to have conversations about water, and how those two sectors of work falls into climate work and climate justice. For Indigenous people, our identity has always been very political. Therefore, us fighting for our identity to be reclaimed, a resurgence of Indigenous identity, is also based in a lot of political settings and understandings. A lot of our policy has been formulated by Western thought and ideology, therefore does not encompass the values that Pueblo people, that all Indigenous people have across the world. Any land justice and water justice fight is going to be just about the same for Indigenous people. We are facing ongoing colonialism as our cultural resources are being exploited for capitalist infinite gain. The globalization of exploited and stolen resources is a global conversation amongst Indigenous people all over. So with that, again, I just want to say thank you, Herkams, to Pueblo Action Alliance and our entire staff and board and members that have been integral in the growth and in the collective conversations that bring us to a point like this. So with that, we offer you all a sister campaign to the LANDBACK movement, which is WATERBACK. Because our pueblos are situated in the Southwest, we must look at LANDBACK as a regional issue. Our geographic location has very much to do with the type of solutions that we are going to create in order for us to adapt to changing climate. This is why it's important that we recognize the original territories of this land base. We did mention just the Pueblos, but I also want to acknowledge all of the other sovereign nations that have existed within the Southwest region that have cultivated Indigenous understandings and knowledge in order for us to manage changing climate, manage land, manage our water, in order for us to sustain and be sustainable and in reciprocity with our earth and river mothers. So with that, I would also like to invite everyone to visualize with us our manifesto, our WATERBACK manifesto. Great, thank you. We can't have land back without water back. Water back to us is the stepping stone in order for us to sever our dependence from the US empire that has disenfranchised Indigenous communities throughout Turtle Island since first contact. How can we as Indigenous people reclaim our identity and pre-colonial understandings of living in reciprocity with the natural world? To us, it also means removing European occupation from water understandings, because this is an important cultural and sacred aspect of many Indigenous people. And in this moment where we are understanding the impacts of what climate change can do to the water, land, and to the people, we offer a resurgence and a reclamation of Pueblo feminist perspective and thought into how we're managing our water, because in our Pueblo traditions, we have gendered our water as mothers. Therefore, a woman's understanding of water is inherent and innate, as we have shared very similar experiences. In the state of New Mexico, which is defined by geopolitical borders, and within the Southwest region, the US empire has based a lot of their water policies on the concept of displacing Indigenous people, on exploiting resources, on land grabs, and basing water's use in market-based formations. Yet, Indigenous people, we have continued to resist colonialism in the way that we in the Southwest, and I'm speaking from a Pueblo perspective, that we have been able to continue thriving with our traditional culture and ceremonies in the ways of song and dance and prayer, which is our offering to the spirit world. But we also need to come up with other solutions and develop specific types of water infrastructure in order for us in sovereign Indigenous nations to be less dependent on federal assistance, because there has been a long colonial history of broken treaties around land, around water, that has misused and exploited our water resources, again, for capitalist gain. So I'd like to invite everybody to think about this question. What would we do without our water in the Southwest? Would we be able to tend our lands, to grow our food, to pray in, to play in, to drink, to live in reciprocity with? How would we be able to thrive on these ancestral homelands? Slide, please. So we bring you this manifesto that is a transformative document. What we have written here is by no means something set in stone, and is something that we have been thinking deeply about in terms of what decolonizing water actually means. Decolonize has been a very popular buzzword in the academy, but we challenge our relatives and our friends and accomplices to learn a new perspective of Indigenous values and worldviews, and how that is implemented in land and water management strategies. This manifesto declares a Pueblo Indigenous perspective on how our waters should be managed now and how they should be managed in the future. Slide, please. So our first point in our manifesto is, within the Pueblo perspective, our rivers are viewed as mothers, and women are the keepers, traditional keepers of water. Our waterways are spiritually governed by mothers and have provided sustenance of what grows on the land, including us. A resurgence of Indigenous feminist water management strategies is the only way to protect our water resources and ensure a clean future for our water. Number 2 is the reclamation for unsettled Indigenous water claims and rights to Indigenous water rights to Indigenous people, which have been governed by 19th century US policy, delivered and stored in 20th century infrastructure in the 21st century. There's a lot of rethinking that needs to happen, I think, in order for us to really understand how we are going to address this issue. Number 3, we have to manage water in revolutionary spaces to ensure that we're thinking radically of water management and water systems as it changes over the realms of time. We look at the geography in the Southwest region as it's taken millions and millions of years for it to look the way that it does. But how is it human impact has caused drastic change in the last 200 years? This is something really to think about. Number 4. Can you go to the next one, please, Marcus? I think Marcus has frozen. We'll just wait for him to come back. I can continue with our slides. Just give me 1 second. Apologies for the technical issues. Okay. All right, moving on. Number 4, in order for Indigenous communities, again, to declare our independence from the US empire, we have to develop water infrastructure. Many Indigenous communities in the Southwest do not have equitable or fair access to water infrastructure to supply drinking water supplies. And so we must look for solutions in order for us to become more dependent from the US empire and sever federal assistance that infringe on our tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And most importantly, we must advocate for the spiritual and natural laws of water, being that she is a living entity. As I mentioned earlier, we all may know the Rio Grande as the Rio Grande, but to us, it is our river mother, Betlashiri Inkewei. And so with this manifesto, we would like to further this conversation on the types of solutions that and concepts that we can implement in order for us to design different types of reimagined water systems that benefit everybody. We offer you this perspective, an Indigenous futuristic perspective on how we want to plan for our futures, how we want to see our lineage thrive on our ancestral homelands. We can understand that maybe we wouldn't see this type of systemic change in our lifetime, but if we are providing stepping stones and laying ideas and planting certain seeds in order for young people to continue building this concept from, that is the type of planning that we would like to implement, especially when it comes to water and land. Because we have the right as Indigenous people to fully enjoy our existence and to fully exist on our original territories. This will enable us to plan our own futures. And because since pre-colonial times, we have been adapting to changing climate. And this is matter of fact. This is something that has been passed down through oral tradition. And through the realms of time, we have cultivated traditional ecological knowledge. This is a foundation in order for us to develop our indigenous technologies that were halted by colonialism and an assimilation into Western ideology. We also think that there needs to be a shift in paradigms. Indigenous worldviews must be in the dominant paradigm in order for us to rethink how we're managing and how we're governing our water systems. Because our perspective, as many different Indigenous perspectives across the world, view our earth and our rivers as our mothers and lead with core values around respect and reciprocity. It's also important that in this region, geographically, we are in the Southwest, we are in Pueblo territories. Therefore, we have to advocate for a Pueblo feminist perspective, as the woman experience is very similar to the woman experience of our river mother and our earth mother. We have our cultural and original instructions that has guided us in order to maintain a healthy watershed, to maintain healthy communities, and to maintain ecological benefits to not just us, but our non-human relatives. We also advocate that this Pueblo feminist perspective also be the catalyst for a resurgence of feminine identity for our river mother, to reclaim personhood as our river is a living entity. She is our mother. This is also an act of reclamation of matrilineal systems that are very traditional to Pueblo people. And all of these perspectives instill values in an arguably valueless system, which are foundational in order for best water management practices. And most importantly, we have to continue with our original instructions and arguably our original watershed management strategies, which is the ability to communicate with our water spirits and ask for rain to give us abundance, to ask for rain to make our rivers flow, and to ask for moisture in the soil in order for our plant relatives to thrive. Our traditions, prayers, and songs and dances have been integral to maintaining healthy watersheds. As we as humans, being partially water, we can communicate again with the hydrologic cycle. And I offer you this quote from a woman from San Felipe who stated that water can talk with water. And we also want to recognize that water is not bound by geopolitical borders. So it's integral in dismantling these political borders, as they also mimic the systems of imperialism and colonialism that have disenfranchised not just Indigenous people, but our Black and people of color relatives who are constantly advocating for imperialist abolition in many regions across Turtle Island. We are a pure example of what it means to co-manage and co-steward water systems. Pueblo people have cohabitated with one another for many generations, as we've had neighboring tribes and villages, and even today share very similar traditional core values in protecting our water resources and protecting sacred places and sacred sites. If a Pueblo perspective is implemented and is the dominant paradigm, we may see opportunities for more co-management and co-stewardship opportunities that look at our watershed as a whole and don't sever our waterways arteries by jurisdictions. I definitely advocate for this type of watershed management strategy, looking at our whole watershed basin as they are interconnected to many different microsystems within the Middle Rio Grande, within the so-called state of New Mexico, within the entire Southwest region. With that, I would like to take some time to address some of the water issues that we are facing in the Southwest region. By no means am I going to go in immense detail on a technical level of these water-related issues, but I do want to give some context for the types of issues that are relevant regionally and geographically to the Southwest. Colonialism is the root cause of all of our water-related issues in the Southwest. We have to acknowledge that colonialism is a root cause for a lot of our climate-related issues. There is a lot of conversation going on in movement spaces about how colonialism has affected our water systems, our food systems, our governance systems, and even how colonialism has attempted to culturally assimilate Indigenous people into Western ideology and Western ways of living, Western lifestyles. But I would like everybody to think about how we can utilize the technology that we have today and the scientific and technical understandings around water that we have today, and how those would be implemented into a paradigm that encompasses an Indigenous worldview. Because not just here in New Mexico are we facing issues, many of our Indigenous frontline communities are also facing impacts, whether that is natural disasters, coastal frontline communities having to relocate from their original territories because their lands are now becoming underwater. And I want to also just nod and remind everybody that a lot of solutions from Indigenous perspectives isn't just for us. It will be beneficial for everybody. In Pueblo communities, we always say that the ceremonies and cultural practices that we do with our community isn't just for us, it is for everyone. It is for the health of the entire world. I'll move on with going over some of the issues that we are presenting to you today. Again, by no means does this mean that these are the only issues that we are experiencing in the Southwest, but it is definitely a broad context of what we are facing here in the Southwest. Firstly is unsettled indigenous water claims. Tribal communities, tribal nations, sovereign nations have been experiencing the impact of colonialism in the water world. On this slide, there's different examples of communities, Indigenous communities in the Southwest who are addressing their unsettled Indigenous water claims, are addressing that water access to their communities is inequitable. And it has been managed by a system that doesn't resonate with our values as Indigenous people. Specifically here in the Middle Rio Grande, our water rights are not quantified. Quantification of water allocations is in fact a Western concept. And so we have to think a bit deeper about how we want to equitably deliver and store our water resources for all of our water users. We understand that Indigenous people are not the only ones that are living in the Southwest, but our ideas and our values could definitely benefit a lot of our downstream water users as we're having more and more conversations and designing different types of solutions in order for us to store water and deliver our compact needs, deliver our water that has been adjudicated through our tribes, through our water tribal settlements. But again, this is a colonial system. And so therefore there is a lot more deeper thinking that needs to happen in this type of conversation. I want to continue with how water infrastructure or development is something that Indigenous communities in the Southwest are also being impacted by. Many of Indigenous water users in the Southwest do not have access to equitable water resources, do not have access to drinking water, do not have access for them to feed their livestock, to water their fields. This is part of the climate justice movement. It is to also address the inequitable and unfair access to water, especially in the desert climate that we live in. But what is the cost associated with developing infrastructure? Who is going to foot this bill? How are tribes that have been disenfranchised and limited to funding opportunities going to improve their water systems in their original territories? Again, we must think a bit more deeply about how we are going to better develop our infrastructure that meets the needs of all stakeholders and water users in the region. This graph comes from the 2018 New Mexico Water Plan, where it clearly states that 61% of that $4 billion on the last slide is for water infrastructure remediation, for repair, for development, a lot of which Indigenous communities aren't benefiting from. As we enter more and more into climate crisis, we are seeing an increase of population. We will continue to see this increase of population in the Southwest, especially during times like COVID, where the Middle Rio Grande apparently has been discovered and is now a hot ticket on the market. How are we going to mitigate increasing populations with our water supply? Over time, we will see that as demand or as supply decrease, demand will increase. This is just a scenario. There are many different scenarios when it comes to understanding changing climate. But if we in the Southwest are experiencing mega drought, we are looking at communities and groups of underrepresented people that will not have access to water resources. We have to look at how urbanization is going to impact our Pueblo territories, our cultural resources, our water. And so understanding where our water gaps in terms of supply and demand are going to be, you know, in the next 100 years, as this all relates to climate. We are experiencing an increase in temperature over time. And what this is going to do to our watershed is it's going to decrease the snowpack that we have in our headwaters of the Rio Grande. When we decrease snowpack, we are also decreasing our water storage. Storing water as snow is a great way in order for us to maintain our water supplies. So what is that going to look like when we are experiencing rising temperatures with less snowpack? We are going to be more prone to water evaporation. We will be more prone to flash types floods, forest fires. I mean, the impacts can definitely go on. But I raise all of these issues because we have to create solutions in order for us to maintain our sustenance and our existence on this landscape, on this cultural landscape. We must decolonize our water systems. If we are decolonizing our water systems and the water governance and institutions that water lie in, we are then beginning to shift a paradigm. We have been within the dominion of white patriarchy that has mismanaged and misused water resources for far too long. It is time for a feminist Pueblo perspective to be leading solutions, designing and creating solutions and planning for our futures in this region. Geographically, in the Southwest, we have to have people in this field that their ancestors have existed in this land since time immemorial, because we carry a genetic memory of how to maintain a healthy watershed. This also lends the opportunity for more Indigenous water and land management strategies that again benefit everyone. And look at our watersheds as a whole. Dismantling political boundaries and jurisdictions is also very integral for the LANDBACK movement, for the WATERBACK movement, for also addressing a lot of social inequities and disparities, as political jurisdictions have hindered policy and rulemaking to ensure further protections, not just on the environment, but also for the health and well-being of our people. And again, to reiterate, for this region specifically, a Pueblo feminist perspective is how we can create these types of solutions to plan for our futures, and again, to enjoy being who we are. So with that, I would like our viewers to think again really deeply about what it would mean to shift our water paradigm, what it would mean in order for Indigenous perspectives and strategies to address our changing climate and all of the disparities and gaps that are spawned from inequitable water and land management. Therefore, we must support Pueblo Indigenous women, trans women, femmes, and non-binary in the water field, in the STEM fields, in the science fields. We have celebrated the technological side of the sciences, and while the research and that understanding is very important for us to create solutions, we also have to think about the paradigms that we exist in order for us to implement solutions that encompass an Indigenous worldview. Therefore, resurgence of Pueblo management strategies must be implemented in a lot of these plans and project proposals. So with that, here in the Southwest, we can't have land back without water back. This is a regionally important issue for Indigenous people and for all people that have settled in this region, that have been occupying Pueblo territories. I want to end my talk with a little story that happened to me recently. Since COVID has been going on, it's been really hard for my family to come together, to enjoy our company, to recreate on the lands, you know, of our ancestors. But we did find that biking was a safe way for us to be together. So one day, myself and my sister, my mother and my dad, we all went on a bike ride in the bosque in San Diego Pueblo. As we were biking along, we were observing our bosque, our little bit of the riparian zone that we have claimed to, enjoying the cottonwood trees, enjoying all of the flora and fauna, the acequias that run along the river, that deliver water to irrigate, you know, our agricultural fields, our gardens, and continue that cultural tradition that Pueblo people have. Pueblo people are known as farmers. We've settled along waterways in order for us to grow our own food and sustain within Pueblo style settlements. And my dad was sharing with me a time when he was a young boy and he was riding his bike from his grandparents' house to the bosque. And he was going along and came to a hard stop because the river had overbanked and then it had flooded and he almost fell in. He told me that this was when he was a child. This was before Cochiti Dam, one of the floodplain reservoirs upstream of the Middle Rio Grande. He told me that this was what the river looked like before there was a dam. And so I'll always hold that story with me throughout my water career, throughout my time in this world, because having information and experience before things have changed and developed, before the channelization of the Middle Rio Grande, at least I have my father's memory of playing in the river before it was controlled by a colonial system. So with that, I want to say thank you, Herkem, to all of our viewers, to our Pueblo Action Alliance staff, to UC Boulder's Environmental Futures program for allowing us to have our very first conversation about WATERBACK. Herkem.
Thank you so much, Julia and Marcus. Before everyone leaves, I wanted to let y'all know that we're going to have a question and answer session now. The way it works is if you would, if you're on the Zoom call, you can just type a Q&A in, and then I'll go ahead and read it out. Or if you are, if you're watching on one of the live streams, then you can also type it into the comments box under the live stream, and Sheldon is going to help us read those ones out. And so kind of just to kick it off, while people are sort of formulating their questions for Julia and Marcus, and I also just wanted to say thank you so much for really for a comprehensive and deep thinking and insightful presentation that really is radical in the original sense of that word, which is to get at the roots of what are the problems. And also, Marcus, thank you to you for designing several of those slides or probably designing the whole presentation. I just think that a lot of the graphic artistry in there was really some nice work. And so Yeah, one of the questions that I was thinking about was getting to this sort of like clash between different ways of thinking about the river and its waters. There's a sense in this sort of dominant water management regime that is really coupled to capitalism that in order to commoditize something, you have to separate it from its surrounding context. Commodities are typically alienated from the larger system in which they're embedded, and I think we see that in a river system like the Rio Grande, for example, where water is dammed and then released in these cubic feet, and it's measured volumetrically, and water is thought of as like almost like in acre feet and in molecules and so forth. And I'm wondering if you all think about that at all, and if how that kind of might compare or contrast with some of the vision that you've laid out today, where rivers are thought of as a more holistic and even mothers to people, and also how does that fit in with the idea of reciprocity?
Yes, so decolonial work is very deep thinking, but it's also creativity and innovation, because when we say things like decolonize, land back, this act of reclamation, it doesn't mean that we're going back in time. It doesn't mean that we are gonna just live in, minimal housing without technology. We are in this current state of technology and innovation and thinking and creativity. And there was actually a question in the chat about steps that need to be taken. And I just want to reiterate that, this is decolonial work. This is undoing generations of European occupation of how we're managing water and how we're managing land. I think it's important for us to also embrace all of the research and technology that we have cultivated over time to understand how climate is changing, how that's going to impact our water resources, how that's going to impact communities, community health, how it's going to impact our cultural integrity as well. So we have to think of things beyond what can we do right now. Because yes, while we're in crisis, while we have to come up with solutions in order for us to think about ways that we're going to protect our water resources, we also have to do the work that is long-term undoing of thinking, which is why we're always reiterating that there needs to be a resurgence of Indigenous identity. If this were, maybe like 200 years, 300 years down the line, maybe this presentation would be in our languages. Maybe this presentation would be translated into the many different dialects and languages of this region. But we're not there yet. There has to be stepping stones in order for us to reimagine how we're going to manage water, because we need water. We need water to drink. We need water to continue with our lifestyles. We need water for cooking. We need water to grow food. We need water for everything. Everything that we have is from the natural world and requires a sufficient amount of water in order to produce it. So it's not going backwards. It's moving forward. It's thinking about new ways, new avenues. We can't continue by the status quo because it is put us in this state of crisis right now. We've seen how the capitalist system has failed many, many people, has failed the global majority. So those frontline communities definitely need to be at the table when we have conversations like this. While we may not have the solutions in this very moment, I wish I did, trust me. But conversations like this, collaborating, learning, sharing information, sharing knowledge are going to be ways that we understand changing climate and how we'll plan accordingly. So that's the answer I can offer in reference to that question.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got another question over in the chat from Sofia Mendoza. It is, what are 3 major challenges that you anticipate must occur in the New Mexico state government that will allow for more of a council-style watershed management system? Oh, changes. What are 3 major changes?
3 is very specific. I suspect that the state will, while very well intentioned to create solutions in order to, achieve 30 by 30 or to have a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies. It's important that we recognize that some of these solutions are going to be market-based. And we argue against these market-based solutions because they still fit in with the dominant paradigm. They still fit in with capitalist values or formations or institutions. So while the state is trying to come up with, again, solutions to address changing climate, it does oftentimes leave out opportunities for community engagement and frontline interaction in order to understand these issues a bit better. And then more broadly, we can't promote solutions that are market-based because this paradigm that we live in is going to be cyclical. We will exploit resources otherwise. We'll exploit resources in order to have rechargeable batteries or the materials that we need to build solar panels or whatever, because like I mentioned earlier, everything we have comes from the natural world. And so we have to think a bit more beyond ourselves. And that's an Indigenous perspective as well. It's not just about me. It's not just about you. It's about everybody. And how can we come up with solutions that benefit the majority rather than just the few, which is how the capitalist system has been functioning.
Okay, now we have a question from Sofia Jenkins Nieto. How do you integrate decolonial thinking with being an academic, since academia is so colonial? Speaking as a STEM major, sometimes it's really hard to do both.
The struggle is real, and I know Marcus feels similarly, and any of us that are, in academia, in the academy, or even thinking about being in academia, because there's so many obstacles that we have to navigate through. It's really hard to explain to people the importance of shifting paradigms to Indigenous perspective, because ultimately, to some people, it means that there's no room for me, or this isn't going to benefit me. But that's what we really need to think about. We have many different types of educational systems within our Pueblo Indigenous communities. And it's important for us to remember that those systems exist. And while we are in academia and we are, reading literature reviews and critiquing, things that have been written in the past, it's really important to also share this information with other people. With PAA, we really make it a point to try and make our information accessible to our communities. And I think that's just a core value in itself as well, sharing information, sharing things that we talked about in school. But it's challenging and it's exhausting having to explain your perspective, to fight for your perspective in academic spaces. But we have to think about, again, the stepping stones that we have to lay for the ones that are coming up behind us, and the pieces that we leave behind in order for them to pick up on. I think that's definitely part of my reason for continuing in academia. I have never been a good student, like until now, you know, with the water work that I'm so passionate about. But we have to remember that education and learning is also very much a part of our communities as well. So it's good to always find people in your academic spaces, find other relatives, and also, you know, feel free to use Pueblo Action Alliance as a resource as you navigate through the system as well.
Okay, we've got another question in the Q&A, and then I'll follow up with a question that was asked from our viewers on YouTube. So the question in the Q&A is from Clem Wings, and he asked, or they asked, can you talk a little bit about data sovereignty?
Talk a little bit about data sovereignty. I'm just kidding. I think it's really important for sovereign nations to collect our own data, because when you're formulating research questions and designing data collection methodologies, you're asking specific questions in order for you to understand the research outcomes or understand like what the issue is and try and design solutions for it. For us, Native people, we're starting to think about how our data can benefit our communities. So a lot of our data collection can be based on our value system. And that, I think, is very integral to promoting data collection and data sovereignty for sovereign nations, because we're going to be asking research questions that are placed in values that we can all resonate with, and that can be beneficial specifically to our communities, to the geographic regions that we occupy. That's my perspective on data sovereignty. I want to advocate that we live in the 21st century and we should be using tools in order for us to visualize data, to understand data, to collect our own data. And that is something that we are trying to also act upon within our organization.
Okay, and this question is from Julianne Warren from the YouTube live stream. I wonder if there might be particular aspects of settler colonial conservation that are troubling to WATERBACK.
I think it's mainly the dominion of white supremacy and white patriarchy that is particularly unsettling to WATERBACK and conservation in general. Because while conservation has been very rooted in, you know, protecting wildlife, to access to public lands, to recreation, to the outdoor experience, it hasn't always included traditional ecological knowledge or the Indigenous perspective of the specific land base, nor has it acknowledged the public land that they advocate for conservation is stolen land, is ancestral land to the original people of this territory. That has been one of the main hurdles in the conservation field is them addressing and recognizing that they are upholding a white supremacist agenda, because it is very hard for them to pass management power to Indigenous people. This has been a power struggle for very long. I don't want to go off on a tangent, because I probably could, because I used to work in conservation for some time and it didn't sit well with me. I felt very tokenized. I felt like my people's voices weren't heard. And so we, again, have to advocate for a resurgence of an Indigenous perspective in order for us to accomplish greater visions like land and water back.
So that's all the questions that I see on my end. Sheldon, do you have any questions that are coming from the live streams?
I don't, not anymore. The last one was from.
Okay, we just had one more question come into the Q&A from Maury. And Maury asked, how can those standard environmental nonprofits, mostly currently white-led, best support PAA, rematriation, and indigenization right now?
This is a good question, and I think this is a question that many environmental big greens, for that matter, are trying to rethink. A lot of the issues lie in staffing and oversight. We've seen recently in the Middle Rio Grande the increased militarization of public lands and how it has affected access for Indigenous people to enjoy our original territories. With that particular incident, it's a staffing issue. There are not avenues for Indigenous peoples to be in these higher positions in these environmental groups, in conservation, in natural resources. A lot of Native people are always on the lower tier of, job or pay scale on power dynamics, on decision-making capabilities. And so there needs to be more pathways for Indigenous people to have access to those types of positions and to implement their ways of thinking, also to celebrate their ways of thinking. We've been combating the status quo of what Indigenous people are for very long, and it has resulted in us from suffering from imposter syndrome, like, do I deserve to be here? Am I smart enough? Am I capable enough? And I know that these are a lot of thoughts that a lot of Native people have going through their heads when they're navigating through academia, when they're navigating through white conservationist spaces, navigating through white supremacy in general. So there needs to be more of stepping back and allowing for Indigenous people to thrive and contribute to creating solutions for better management practices, I think.
Okay, well, I don't have any more questions on my end, and we've been going for almost an hour and a half now. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But I just wanted to take a moment to thank Julia and Marcus and Sheldon and the Pueblo Action Alliance once again for sharing all of this knowledge with us. We really appreciate it. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and call it a night. Thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Chilton, and thank you everybody who joined us. And
Tawatse Hopa. Thank you, everyone. Be safe and yeah, just follow us with our work in the future. Thank you again, Chilton and Julia. Thank you for your knowledge, and Sheldon, thank you for working with us on Restream.
Thank you.